Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series, Literacy as Opportunity. My name is Laura Almazara, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. We're so excited to have you here with us today. I have a few notes to share before we get started with today's webinar, which is knowledge building in middle school. We are recording the webinar, and we're going to email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you'd like, and everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance via email. If you want to access closed captions, just click on the closed captions button in the bottom tray. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A, and we welcome comments in the chat. So to get us started, we'd love to hear where you all are joining us from. I can get us started. I am in Jersey City, New Jersey, and it's a very lovely spring day here. I'm normally based in Phoenix, Arizona, and it is usually a bit hotter. So I'm really enjoying myself. I got people from all over. This is lovely. Oh, I just saw someone from Phoenix, New York. That's new to me. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a quick note, we have one more webinar left in our series, which is on Thursday. We're going to be joined by Dr. Nell Thompson from the Transformative Reading Teacher Group, who's going to talk about language screening. To find out more, visit amplify.com/literacy-is-opportunity-series. And thank you so much for joining us. I would love to welcome our incredible presenters, Dr. Jade Wexler and Dr. Alexandra Shelton. Dr. Wexler is an associate professor in the Department of Counseling, Higher Education, and Special Education at the University of Maryland. And Dr. Shelton is an assistant professor of special education at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Welcome, Dr. Wexler and Dr. Shelton.
Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for being here today. We're really excited to talk about knowledge building in middle school. Again, my name is Jade Wexler, and I'm an associate professor at University of Maryland, and I'm joined with my amazing colleague, Alexandra Shelton, and she's an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins. The work that you're going to hear about today is mostly supported by two grants. One is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, and one is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education. So just a little agenda here. I'm going to start us off talking about the state of adolescent literacy and what really works. What do we know from the evidence about adolescent literacy instruction? And Alex is going to provide us an overview of a set of evidence-based practices called PACT, Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text, and Schoolwide Pact. And then we're going to give you kind of that high-level overview of the practices that make up PACT, Comprehension Canopy, Essential Words, and Critical Reading. And we'll leave you here today with some resources to support implementation of these practices. Of course, in 1 hour, we will just be touching on the highlights of these practices, but we'll encourage you to review the resources for more information. All right, so the state of adolescent literacy. As many of you know, every 2 years, we give a nationally representative sample of students, the NAEP, or the National Assessment of Educational Progress, across the nation, which helps us kind of get the pulse of literacy achievement across the nation. And you can see here that in 2022, 30% of our 8th graders were not able to perform at the basic level of proficiency. Okay, so students can perform at the basic level, proficient, and advanced, and we had 30% not performing at that basic level. And so what do students have to do to be able to perform at the basic level? They need to be able to do some basic things, locate information in a text, identify the main idea of the text, which we ask them to do all the time, right? Identify theme or author's purpose, make simple inferences, and of course, interpret meanings of words as they're used in the text to help build comprehension of that text. And unfortunately, matters are worse for certain subgroups. We have right here, these are 8th graders who receive free and reduced lunch and those who do not. So you can see that over time, there is a gap between those two groups of students. And the pattern remains true for 8th graders with disabilities and students without disabilities, as well as students who are English learners and students who are not English learners. So not to depress you all, but in other words, we have a lot of students who continue to struggle to read and understand text into the upper grades. And this is, of course, going to impact their ability to understand content and build knowledge. And this is extremely critical for this group of students. So what do we know that works for secondary students? Well, one reliable source that we can turn to is the U.S. Department of Education Institute for Education Sciences. And one thing that the IES does is they convene a group of experts on certain topics, and they come out with recommendations based on the synthesized evidence on those topics. So this one here was a practice guide that provides recommendations for what we should see in terms of adolescent literacy instruction for our secondary students. And so this is based on evidence, and these are the IES practice guides. You can just Google them. Don't do that now. You can do that later, but this is a great resource for you all. And in 2008, these were the recommendations that came out, okay, based on strong or moderate evidence. And many of these are going to be familiar with you all. So first of all, we need to be providing students with explicit vocabulary instruction, comprehension strategy instruction, lots of opportunities for students to engage in discussion of text meaning and interpretation. Of course, we need to think about ways to increase their motivation and engagement in their learning. And one thing I like to tell teachers all the time is that one of the best ways to motivate some of these students at the secondary level is to provide them with good instruction. So using data so that we know that we're really meeting their needs is going to definitely motivate them, because all of these students really want to learn. And then some of our students are going to need intensive intervention, so working on more foundational level skills. And in addition to these practices that we should see across the content areas, we need to really pay attention to how we're delivering these practices. So we need to be providing vocabulary instruction using explicit instruction, lots of modeling, lots of thinking aloud, lots of opportunities for students to respond and practice, and receiving immediate corrective feedback. And so if you think about these top 3 recommendations here, what we're really talking about is comprehension building practices, knowledge building practices. And so this needs to be a focus at the secondary level for all of our students. We need all of our content area teachers to integrate these types of practices into their typical content area instruction on a very regular basis. So in addition to that 2008 guide, I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but another guide came out in 2022. And this guide is focused on those reading interventions. So students who need more intensive intervention, and this is for students in grades 4 through 9. And they also came out with recommendations based on the evidence. And here are the recommendations that are built on strong or moderate evidence. And you'll see somewhat of a pattern here. So first of all, these are kids who need supplemental intensive intervention. And so, of course, many of these students are going to need to continue to build decoding skills so that they can read those complex multisyllabic words that they encounter in their text on a regular basis. They need to be able to read them fluently. But these students are at the secondary level, and we expect them to be acquiring content knowledge. So they also need to be using a set of comprehension building practices, just like we talked about in the 2008 guide, to help them make sense of text and ultimately build knowledge. And then they need to be doing that with text that we call in this guide stretched text. So it's text that's a little bit of a stretch for them. And we also need to think about providing this type of instruction to these students with a lot of explicit instruction, again, opportunities to respond and practice and receive immediate corrective feedback. So also in this guide, you will see this theme here of building students' skills and so that they can acquire comprehension and content knowledge. So regardless of their reading skills, whether they're students who really need to continue to work on decoding or not, there is a focus at the secondary level on reading to acquire that content knowledge. They go to science, they go to social studies, they go to English language arts, math, etc. Right? So the question becomes, how can we really build their reading skills and their content knowledge at the same time? Many of these students still need to be working on some of those foundational level skills while also building their content knowledge. So I'm going to turn this over to Alex now, who's going to review a set of practices that really align with the recommendations in this guide.
Hi, everyone. So PACT is an answer to the question that Jade asked. PACT is a way to support students' literacy development and their content knowledge, and it stands for Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text. So PACT began in U.S. history, 8th grade U.S. history classes, and really took a unit-based content approach to supporting students' content acquisition through literacy. And here were the practices: Comprehension Canopy, which built students' background knowledge; Essential Words, which built their vocabulary knowledge. And we can think of vocabulary knowledge as an extension of background knowledge. There's also Critical Reading, which facilitates students' text comprehension. And then at the end of these 2-week units, there was team-based learning, and that consisted of comprehension checks and knowledge acquisition as a way to culminate the mini lessons, or the mini unit, so to speak. And there's a lot of evidence of effectiveness of PACT. And you see here that Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words are circled, and that's because these are the knowledge building practices of PACT. So let's look at how it's effective. The first study that investigated the effects of PACT found that students who received instruction in U.S. history using the PACT practices outperformed students who received regular instruction or business as usual instruction on the same content. The PACT students outperformed the business as usual students in content knowledge, content area reading comprehension, and general reading comprehension. And this study has been replicated quite a few times. So in a follow-up study, they also found that PACT really supports content knowledge and content area reading comprehension. We've also found that PACT supports students who have disabilities, or students who are English learners, or students who are English learners with disabilities. So there's a lot of evidence of effectiveness of PACT. This is a way to support students' content knowledge through literacy. But remember, it started just in 8th grade U.S. history. So that raises the question, how can we extend PACT beyond social studies? And the way that we've done this is with Schoolwide Pact, or SW Pact. So in Schoolwide Pact, we've taken 3 of the practices and we've extended them across content areas and across grade levels. There's still this content approach because the goal is still to support students' text comprehension and their content knowledge. But now it's not necessarily in this packaged unit. It can be applied to individual text, which is something that we'll talk about. So the first practice, again, is Comprehension Canopy. You're building students' background knowledge by introducing a topic with a motivational springboard and providing necessary background information. You're then moving on to Essential Words, where we're building students' vocabulary knowledge. As the teacher, we select 1 to 2 words that are essential to understanding the text and use a specific routine to teach each essential word or concept or idea. And then after those 2 knowledge building practices, we move on to critical reading. So in critical reading, the goal is to facilitate students' comprehension of the text. And we do that by facilitating their use of partner reading to read through the text. But we also use it as an opportunity to get students to discuss the text and to answer critical reading questions that require them to use evidence from the text. So altogether, these are the three practices that make up Schoolwide Pact. And so we're going to look at what each of these practices looks like, and you'll see how Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words are the knowledge building practices of Schoolwide Pact. And then one thing to note, all of this is about building students' comprehension to support their content acquisition. But the focus of the knowledge building practices, the focus of Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words depends on the focus of critical reading, the knowledge that you want students to acquire from reading the text. And that's why in planning, we plan critical reading before we plan the knowledge building practices, even though in implementation, we're implementing or delivering Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words first. And then one thing that I wanted to point out is that the PACT practices and Schoolwide Pact in particular really aligns well with the IES guidance that Jade talked about. So the 2008 practices for that focus on adolescent literacy, as well as intervention practices. So you'll see some examples of that, and we'll point them out when there's alignment between Schoolwide Pact and those practice guides. So the goal here is to support students' comprehension and to support their content knowledge. And so we really aspire to do this by increasing students' dosage, increasing the amount of knowledge building practices they have access to, increasing their exposure to text across a school-wide literacy model. And so the way we like to think about this is that if each teacher implements a school-wide PACT lesson just once a week, that means one science lesson using school-wide PACT, one social studies lesson using school-wide PACT, and one ELA lesson using school-wide PACT. And perhaps this is a student who is in a supplemental intervention setting, and they're going to get these knowledge building practices every day during the week. That means we are giving students 8 lessons in which they have the opportunity to build their knowledge, to engage with text, to comprehend text, and to acquire their content knowledge. And so we really emphasize this school-wide literacy approach. It's not just the job of the ELA teacher or the intervention teacher to support students' literacy development, because at the secondary level, like Jade said, we expect and want to support students in acquiring knowledge through literacy. And so we have a couple of different options for what this might look like. And this first option that you see here, the SW PACT practices are all in one day, one lesson. We start off with Comprehension Canopy, we move on to essential words, and then critical reading. And so there might be 4 sections of a text, and critical reading ends with culminating question. It's a question that students are able to answer by the end of the text, which really demonstrates their text comprehension and their content knowledge. So you can do this all in one day, or you can distribute the practices. And that's what we see here with this second option. So on Monday, we see Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words. Those are the knowledge building practices. And then we introduce just the first section of the text, and then another section the next day, and then the next day. And then we finally might end the lesson with the culminating question on a Thursday. But one thing that's important to do if you use this approach is relate the text, relate students' critical reading of section 2 and section 3 and section 4 to the knowledge building practices, to Comprehension Canopy and Essential Words. And I see a question, PACT stands for Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text. So that is what the implementation of PACT can look like. So before we start teaching the lesson using the Schoolwide Pact practices, we need to select the text. And Schoolwide Pact, unlike the original Pact, is curriculum and text dependent, meaning that you can use the practices to incorporate evidence-based literacy instruction into any content area and with any text. But we do have some recommendations. And so I'm going to let Jade explain what those recommendations are.
Okay. And thanks for bearing with me. I'm trying to click slides while Alex is talking. So first of all, like Alex said, you'll want to select a text. And this text can be text that you already have in your curriculum that the teachers have to use anyways, part of a text that they have to use anyways, or a text that aligns with the topic that you're going to teach, right? So if the science teacher is going to teach about photosynthesis, they might select a text, for example, from another website like readworks.org that aligns with that topic. But here are some general recommendations. First of all, the text should cover key concepts. So we typically do this routine with expository text. It supports whatever lesson or unit objective that you have. So these, again, this is content and text agnostic, these practices, and they link to the content standards. The text needs to be comprehensible by the students. So it should be pretty much at their average instructional level. for at least most of the class. There should be few unknown words, although we know there will be some. And because of the practices that we're going to teach them before they read the text, we're going to give them some essential words instruction. We know that some of these words are going to be unknown, and we're going to pre-teach them. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And it's great when the text is clearly organized, such as it has 4 clear sections, for example. And then we want the text to be interesting. We want it to promote student engagement. Ideally, it's a manageable length, like I said, about 4 sections, or you could take a longer text and kind of break it up for this PAC lesson into 3 to 4 sections. And we want it to be worthy of a good discussion. We want the students to be interested in reading and trying to understand this text. Okay, so the first practice, as Alex described, is Comprehension Canopy. So once you have your text, you're going to introduce this text using Comprehension Canopy. And this is really a way to build students' background knowledge on this text before they read it. So one thing to note about Comprehension Canopy is that it should be short, okay? We want students to have a chance to get their eyes on text. We want to minimize the teacher talk, and we want them to have the chance to read and comprehend on their own. But this gives them what we like to call a little bit of that instructional Velcro, okay? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to introduce the topic with some kind of motivational springboard. And you're providing them with necessary background information, necessary instructional Velcro that you think will really help them understand that text. Okay, so the 2 purposes, again, you're motivating them. You want them to kind of get a little interested in it, give them a little hook, and then you're building some of their background knowledge on this, which will help them ultimately comprehend it and acquire content knowledge. So in terms of that first purpose, to motivate students, you can do this in a lot of different ways. And we've seen some very creative things that teachers have done. And again, we just want to remind you that while you could probably design a lesson that's 30 minutes, that's really cool to give them that background knowledge, that is not the time or place for this. We want this to be at least 3 to 5 minutes and no more. Okay. So you have flexibility where you can provide them this background knowledge in some oral way. You could give them a quote or a statistic, a written way. We've seen teachers use songs and multimedia. One of the most common ways, and the ways that we typically do it, is we show them a picture of something that's going to relate to the text. All right. And then the second thing is the purpose is to build their background knowledge. So you want to make sure that you really pre-plan this and think about, why are you showing them this particular picture? How is it connected to the text? How is it giving them that little boost, that little instructional Velcro that's going to help them understand this text? I know, before my son had been on a plane, we read things in books, but he really didn't have a lot of background knowledge about what it meant to go to an airport and go through the security thing and do all those things. Some of our students don't have these experiences. So we need to think about what little nugget of information can you give them that's really going to enhance their comprehension. And this is actually kind of a fun part of the lesson. And it also, you want this background knowledge to be well thought out in terms of it aligning with that culminating question that Alex was talking about. So everything kind of goes back to that overall comprehension that you want them to walk away with after they're done with the text. Okay, so if you were here with me, I would have somebody from the crowd read this, but I will go ahead and read this and we'll think about it. So some students have had experience with snow and winter storms, others have not. Some students have seen governments collapse, others have not. Some students have been taught multiplication facts, others have not. Some students have been to every museum in the community, others have not. Some students have access at home to new media texts, while others must depend on school and libraries for internet access. So I think you get the gist here that, our students come to us with lots of different background knowledge, and their background knowledge can be a huge asset to what they bring to comprehension and understanding of content, but it also can be lacking in some ways with certain topics that we're teaching them. So again, we want to think about our students' background knowledge for the most part and how we can give them a little bit of background knowledge before they read the text. Okay, so this is an example from Comprehension Canopy in one of our lessons. And at the end, we'll tell you about some resources that we're going to give you. Again, we can only give you kind of some highlights today. But we have some great lessons for you. And so what the teacher will do is briefly introduce the topic of a text and then provide that springboard to kind of motivate them. All right, so the teacher might say something like, you may already know a great deal about plants. You may already know that they need water and sunlight to gather nutrients to grow. The process that plants use to transfer water and sunlight into nutrients is called photosynthesis. So I'm just introducing the passage here, or the text. And then, what you're going to do is the springboard. Okay, so you might show the students these two images, and you might point them to that first image there and say, different plants grow in different areas and are specially designed to grow there. Let me show you a few. This first plant here is a fern. It grows in shady places in the rainforest. Do you notice how its fronds are very large? It's so that the plant can gather as much sunlight as possible. The plant is large and bright green because the soil is so rich in nutrients. But now let's look at this other set of plants here. Okay, so these plants are in the desert. Turn to a partner and tell them two things that you notice about how these plants grow and why you think it might be that way. And then you'll have students do a turn and talk. And I also want to highlight that this turn and talk should be very quick as well. Okay, so maybe 20 to 30 seconds talking about this, not any longer. Then you bring them back together and you say, so the plants look different based on where they grow. And today you are going to learn about a plant that grows in such a difficult place that it doesn't act like a typical plant at all. Are you all motivated out there? There's lots of you out there, and I know you're motivated. And I should have mentioned that the text that you all are about to read is one called Venus Flytrap. So you'll see the text in our resources, and we'll point that out for you later, okay? I know I was motivated to read Venus Flytrap. Okay, so that is it. That is Comprehension Canopy. And if you're out there thinking, ooh, that's kind of simple, you're right. It is kind of simple. But we found that all the content area teachers that we've worked with, when they're implementing these lessons, love doing Comprehension Canopy. It's relatively easy, the students like it, and it's really helpful for building students' content knowledge, background knowledge, so that they can read and understand the text a little bit better that they're about to read. All right, so that's Comprehension Canopy, and now we move into essential words. And essential words is just what you think, it's vocabulary instruction, but we're going to show you a certain routine that you can use to implement this essential words instruction. And what you'll do is you will ultimately select one, maybe two words to go through this routine to teach kids that will help them understand the text. And as Alex mentioned, these Comprehension Canopy and essential words practices really help with that content knowledge, the building knowledge before they get into the text and read and understand it themselves. So we're going to show you this routine on how you can teach these essential words. All right, so something to really think about is that essential words, again, it helps build that background knowledge, and the purpose is to continue to teach these content-specific concepts. The words should align with the new content that you're trying to teach them, so it supports the learning of that content, and it assists in comprehension when they're reading on their own, when they get to the comprehension, or excuse me, the critical reading practices that they'll do right after this. So what are essential words? Pretty much what you think, right? So they're words, terms, and concepts that are really critical for understanding the content. But they're not just the words that students don't know. They're related concepts, related words. Again, we like to think of it as sort of that Velcro ball, okay? Instructional Velcro that will help them connect to other important ideas that they are about to read and learn about in this text. So it's academic vocabulary and it supports reading comprehension and content knowledge. And here is what one of the essential words routines looks like. And we have a lot of these for you in the sample resources that we'll give you. All of them look the same across content areas, and we do that intentionally because it helps with generalizability of these practices as well. So this is from the science lesson that we have for you on Venus flytrap. And one of the words that we selected to teach using this routine was nutrients. And so the first thing that you're going to do is give the students a student-friendly definition of the word. So you can see there that nutrients, it says a substance that plants, animals, and people need to live and grow. The second thing is you'll give them some images to teach the word again. And again, this is only if it makes sense, because sometimes there are words that there really is not a great image for, and we find that that just confuses kids. So you want to make sure that it makes sense to show them these images. You will then give them some related words, an example usage of the word, and that should come straight from the text that you are about to have the students read. And then you'll give examples and non-examples of nutrients right here. And I like to tell teachers about the difference between examples and non-examples, that non-examples really help students understand the boundaries of what a word is and what a word is not. So a non-example is not necessarily a total opposite of a keyword. Okay, so if I was teaching the word boat, for example, we know boats float. We know they help us get from here to there. And maybe I might show a canoe and say, oh, does it help us get from here to there? Yes. Does it float? Yes. Do we get in it? Yes. That's another characteristic of a boat. Maybe I'll show, a cruise ship, and does it float? Yes. Does it sort of help us get? Yes. Yes. Well, what if I show a buoy? Does a buoy float? Yes. But is the purpose to take us from here to there? No. And do we get in it? No, right? So there are words that are not quite the key word, but not an opposite. I'm not showing an airplane. I'm showing something that's really close to that word. And it doesn't work for all words, but it's a really powerful way to use non-examples to help show the boundaries of what a word is and what a word is not. So right here, we're talking about red dye number 5. It's in foods, but it's not a nutrient. And then you would discuss why. And then finally, again, they do a very quick, not long, a very quick turn and talk about nutrients. So what are your favorite things to eat? What nutrients are in your favorite things to eat? And this is to help bring this back to connecting the word to the students' lives. And I also like to tell teachers to challenge students to use the keyword nutrients in their discussion, because otherwise we know that students just start talking about something and they forget, why am I talking about this anyways? Okay. All right. So again, images should only be used when they clearly represent the essential word, and examples and non-examples should only be used when they really clarify the boundaries of those words. All right, so this is from another one of our sample lessons about Fred Korematsu, and just to show you kind of how we planned for this, how do we know what essential word we want to teach, or words and concepts? One thing that the teacher can do is kind of go through and highlight words or concepts that come up frequently, and then maybe choose that as the keyword, but they can really sneak in other words or related concepts into this essential words organizer. So this isn't your typical, give them the word, give them the definition, and that's it. So right here, you see that we chose to teach activist, and you can see that we snuck in that activists often have to do with social change or political change, and we snuck that into our essential words organizer. You can see we put some related words in there because activists are often advocates or promoters of something. And then you see how we have in there 4 different ways that activists work. And again, how activism really relates to their life. So again, it's kind of a Velcro ball approach to it. It's not just teaching that one word, but lots of related words and concepts that really can help us understand the deep meanings of these words and related concepts. So that's Comprehension Canopy and essential words. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex to provide an overview of the critical reading practice.
Okay, so at this point, we have built students' knowledge, right? We've done Comprehension Canopy and we've done essential words. So they have a bit of knowledge that they're going to need to work with the text and to engage with the text. So with critical reading, as you'll see on the next slide, it's the meat of it. So you're going to spend the most of your time focusing on critical reading. You'll have students read the text with a partner, and that's great fluency practice, which relates to the 2022 practice guide from IES. And then you're going to facilitate these discussions by introducing discussion questions for each section of the text. So let's look at what this looks like. So the very first step is for you to introduce the text, the topic of the text, and the culminating question. So going back to our Venus flytrap example, we might say, now we're going to read a passage called Venus flytrap. That's introducing the text. It's about a plant designed in a very peculiar way. That's introducing what the text is about. By the end of the reading, I want you to be able to answer our culminating question. How is the Venus flytrap designed specifically for its surroundings? The culminating question helps us remember the big picture information we learned from reading this text. And if we're using a graphic organizer, we can have students write that culminating question down on their organizer, or we can include it on a pre-filled organizer for them. And so just a bit more about the culminating question. It's the big question that they can answer at the end of the text. And if they can answer that question, that means they have an overall understanding of the text. And it means that they can summarize the text. And if they have an overall understanding of the text and can summarize the text, that means they can acquire, or they have acquired, content knowledge from this text. And remember, this is the focus of SW Pact. How can we use literacy to support students' acquisition of content knowledge? So once we have introduced the text and what the text is about, it's time to get into reading the text. And so the very first step is to read a predetermined section of the text. We recommend that the teacher reads the first section to present a model of fluent reading for all students. So you would read the first section of the text, and then, as you'll see on the next slide, you'll introduce the first critical reading question. So this is a question that directly relates to that section. If students can answer this question, that means that they understood this section. And so we want them to work on answering this question in a short discussion. And so that means that we might have students do a turn and talk, or someone in the chat said a turn and learn. And then we might have them share out afterwards with the entire class. And that share out is really important because it gives you the opportunity to provide feedback to all students. So the turn and talk or the turn and learn means that students are having frequent opportunities to respond and practice, and then you're giving them that feedback to say, to probe and to push and to make sure that they've gotten the necessary information from that section. You're going to complete these steps for each remaining section, but now if you've modeled with the first section, or if you read the first section, now it's time to facilitate partner reading with the remaining sections. And partner reading would take a lot more time to discuss, but we're happy to point you all to more resources on how to facilitate partner reading effectively and efficiently. So that was the first example of what to do during critical reading. So with the Venus flytrap, I would read the first section of the text, and then I would say something like, now I want you to turn and talk with your neighbor about why the Venus flytrap eats insects. And that is a question that they can answer based on that first section. So this is what I would do or facilitate for each section of the Venus flytrap. But there's a second option for critical reading, and that is to incorporate Get the Gist into critical reading. Get the Gist is a strategy that students can use to identify the main idea of a text. This is not to replace any knowledge building practices, but if you think back to what Jade shared about the NAEP data, we find that 30% of students are unable to identify the main idea and demonstrate other foundational literacy practices. And so this gives students an opportunity to get some practice. They would receive explicit instruction on how to get the main idea or identify the main idea using Get the Gist. And main idea is really important because if students can identify the main idea of each individual section, they can then synthesize those main ideas or synthesize the information to answer the culminating question at the end. And remember, if they can answer the culminating question at the end, that means they understood the text overall, and that means they can summarize it. And then from there, you can build more advanced literacy skills, all working towards supporting students' acquisition of content knowledge. So with Get the Gist, there are 3 key steps for students to complete. And so we as the teacher are going to provide explicit instruction on how to complete Get the Gist in these steps. The first step is to answer the following question: who or what is this section mostly about? The second question is to answer the second step is to answer what is the most important information about the who or what that you identified during the first step. And then students can put the answers together to write a gist statement. And a gist statement is a statement that identifies or that explains what the main idea is. So we have some guidance on how students can complete each step. And that's because for some students, it may not be enough to just walk through the questions. And so we want to provide more scaffolding and more explicit instruction for some students. But the goal is that over time, we can decrease scaffolds and increase independence. But here on this cue card, you see things like prompting students to ask, is anyone or anything mentioned most frequently, to identify the who or what? Or what information relates to the who or what, or the culminating question, or the essential words, when it's time for them to identify the most important information about the who or what. And then we also give students some guidance on how to write a short but complete gist statement. So Get the Gist can be incorporated into critical reading. But whether you take the critical reading question discussion approach or the main idea, Get the Gist approach, the last step is to answer the culminating question. But one thing that I want to point out is that even with Get the Gist, even if you're having students identify main ideas, it's still important to have students work with each other, to have short text-based discussions, because that aligns with the 2008 practice guide. It's very helpful for students to work with each other and to have these text-based discussions, because that promotes their content or their comprehension and their content knowledge as well. And so I just want to emphasize that you don't have to choose between supporting comprehension, supporting content knowledge, and supporting their skill development when it comes to literacy, because all of it is important and all of it can be used to support their content knowledge. So again, the last step is to answer the culminating question. So first, you'll reintroduce the culminating question that's possibly written on a graphic organizer or somewhere on the board for students to refer to. You would then prompt students to review their critical reading answers if you went with the first option, or their gist statements if you went with the second option. So they'll review their critical reading answers or their gist statements, they'll synthesize the information, and then you would facilitate a turn and talk or a turn and learn where they're discussing their answers to the culminating question. And then you would end by facilitating a class-wide discussion of the answer to the culminating question. Just like with critical reading questions, you may need to probe students or provide probing questions. And then the other option that you can use with culminating question is to have students write down their answer to the question before the turn and talk and before the share out, and then have them turn it in, because then that's formative data for you to use. That helps you understand, okay, who comprehended the text, who acquired the necessary content knowledge, and who needs additional support. Or perhaps there are misconceptions that I should address in the next lesson, because then that relates back to providing students with immediate corrective feedback or pretty quick feedback afterwards. So before I talk about resources to support implementation, there was one question in the chat. Is the culminating question different than the essential question of a unit or lesson plan? You can think of the culminating question as the essential question for a lesson, but not necessarily the entire unit. Because with Schoolwide Pact, we're using the practices for each individual text. So you want to make sure that there's alignment between your culminating question and the text, although it may also align to the essential question of the unit, but that part is not a requirement, because we want this to be able to be used across curriculums, across content, across units, across lessons. So we have lots of resources to support teachers' implementation of the PACT practices, and you can find them on the website aimcoaching.org. So we have sample lessons on that website. You can find the Venus flytrap lesson there, the Fred Korematsu lesson there, and other lessons. You'll also find modules related to how to build school-wide Tier 1 literacy models at the middle school level, but also modules related to Comprehension Canopy and essential words and critical reading. And we're constantly updating the resources on the website so that you'll find things like the Get the Gist cue card or the Get the Gist graphic organizer. And then we also have mini lessons because an important skill that we found some students lack is the ability to know who or what a section is about if there are lots of pronouns being used. So we have a pronoun mini lesson, or I think 2 pronoun mini lessons there that can be easily incorporated to as a mini lesson, essentially, to support students' use of or understanding of pronouns. And then we have these criteria for success checklists. There's a different checklist for each practice. So one for Comprehension Canopy, one for essential words, and one for critical reading. And it's just a way for teachers to know that they're addressing or meeting the essential elements of each practice that's a part of Schoolwide Pact. So that is what we have for you. The last thought that we wanted to share is that by implementing Schoolwide Pact, teachers are building students' knowledge through Comprehension Canopy and essential words, and then facilitating students' text comprehension using critical reading. And all of that is for the goal of promoting students' content knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wexler and Dr. Shelton. That was really informative, and we had a lot of great questions in the chat, which you were so good to answer already. I just want to quickly highlight them in case anyone didn't hear or see our answers. So if you wouldn't mind just going over them, I'll throw the questions out to you. So first was just, can you share what PACT stands for?
PACT stands for Promoting Adolescents' Comprehension of Text, and the SW in front of it is Schoolwide Pact, but we know that's a little bit of a tricky name. It's really what we're talking about is content area wide pact. So some schools that we've been working with have chosen to really think about how they want to roll this out when they're creating a school-wide model. So they may do it grade level at a time, but the important thing is that it's implemented across content areas in a grade at least, because if you think about it, again, from the point of view of the student, they're getting increased dosage of instruction as they go to these different classes throughout their day. It also really helps with generalizability of the practices. We know that if you think about if we teach them, for example, an evidence-based way to get the main idea with that get the gist practice in, let's say, their English language arts class, and then they go to social studies and their social studies teacher says, oh, I'd like you to read this and tell me the main idea. Our students don't always naturally say, oh, I learned this great strategy in my English language arts class. I think I'll go ahead and apply that over here in my social studies class. Doesn't always happen, right? So we need our content area teachers to constantly be modeling the use of these practices in their own content areas to reinforce generalizability.
Thank you so much. One other question, which I think you answered, Dr. Shelton, is can the Schoolwide Pact be used with multiple modality learning?
It can. So our primary focus is on supporting students' comprehension of written text to acquire their content knowledge, but we have definitely seen teachers make adaptations so that this can be applied to to a wider definition of text, so to speak. And that can be really helpful for students who are not reading on grade level, for example, or English learners. But we also want to remember that we want to provide students with exposure to written text so that they're improving their reading skills at the same time.
Wonderful, thank you. We had one come in sort of toward the end. Casey just simply asked, do you have any modules available for elementary school, or is it all middle school?
We don't have any available for elementary, but the modules that are up there would definitely apply. So I would encourage people to just look to, especially, really 3rd or 4th grade and up, they're going to apply. We've also had several high schools start to try to use the practices as well. So really good for any of these grades, reading,
Great.
text.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The last question I noted down, which you answered just a few minutes ago, Dr. Shelton, is the culminating question different than the essential question of a unit or lesson plan?
So I would say that the culminating question is the essential question of the lesson, but not necessarily the essential question of the entire unit, because you want to make sure that the question aligns to the specific text, because if students can answer that question for that text, that means they have gotten the necessary knowledge for that lesson or from that particular lesson.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we've hit all of our questions. I just added those links to the resources you shared again in the chat, so you can all more easily access them. Thank you all so much for joining us. As a quick reminder, you're going to be getting a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a link to the presentation deck as well. We do have one more webinar left in this series. To find out more, just visit amplify.com/literacy-is-opportunity series. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.